Hey everybody, this is Jorge from the Big Band Podcast. Today I'm joined by Greg Satell. Greg Satell is a popular writer, a speaker, and an innovation advisor whose work has appeared in Harper's Business Review, Forbes, Fast Company, Inc., and other A-list publications. You can find Greg's blog at digitaltanto.com and on Twitter at digitaltanto. His first book, Mapping Innovation, a playbook for navigating a disruptive age, is what we'll be talking about today. Hey Greg, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jorge.
So Greg, what are you up to these days?
Writing, consulting, speaking, thinking sometimes.
Inking?
Writing. You might have heard I've written a book.
Yes. Yes. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Maybe you and I have not known each other for a while, but we followed each other for a while on Twitter. That's how we met.
I always enjoy your stuff. It's always very thought-provoking.
Yeah, and likewise. So when you when you told me that you were writing a book, I was like, wow, I think he finally went for it because people having egging me to do it myself, but I was not quite ready to do it myself. So when I saw yours, I was like, wow, well he went for it. This is going to be interesting. Because I've been reading your blog for a while, and everything you write is your book is very articulate, very well explained. I think it's very different from other innovation books that are out there, and in the sense that it's down to earth, but also with as thought provoking as it's necessary to be, well, not over the top, but very very specific. And
thank you. That's really great to hear.
Yeah. And taking that further is, as there's many innovation books out there, including blogs like yourselves and mine. So what was the motivation? I mean, what motivated you to write the book? And also, did you see something missing out there that motivated you to do it? What was it?
Yeah, well, the problem I had with a lot of innovation books is most of them, I didn't find them all that helpful. They were, okay. Most of them are interesting, but usually there's sort of two classes of innovation books. You'll have the ones that are more academic with case studies, and they're analytical and they organize things into a framework, which can be useful if it's done well, but doesn't really fit a manager's context. I always think in terms of the core strategic question every manager must answer is, what do I do? And while books like that from the more academic books, they can be very helpful in understanding how things happen, and help you learn from the case studies and experiences of other enterprises. They're not really focused on that specific question. What do I do? The other type of innovation book is from usually some sort of memoir of somebody who had a successful company or a successful project or successful experience. And those can be really interesting, but at the same time, just because something worked in another company in another organizational context doesn't mean it's going to work for you. So I really wanted to write something that would help me answer the questions that I wanted to know about when I was still running companies, which is, what do I do?
Yeah. And, as I was saying, I've gotten to read a lot of books about innovation. Yourself too. I mean, I'm pretty sure you've gotten other bloggers or authors come at you and send you their book. You read it, and like you were saying, I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying is the different types of books and angles on it. Like, for example, I can tell you that one of the best books that I've read actually was in the trenches, and that's the Creativity Inc. from Ed Catmull.
That is an excellent book.
Yeah,
And even the last chapter about Steve Jobs is worth the price of the whole book. But that was really an absolutely fantastic book.
Yeah, and he doesn't talk about like what you usually see written, all over the place, which is the more catchy stuff. But he actually talks about what happens on the day to day and how decisions get made. And
yeah, it was very honest. I loved his line when something like, every movie at Pixar starts out as crap. Our job is to take it from crap to not crap.
Yes. And what I was going with this thought is that your book is very pragmatic, but also makes you think, which it should. And the part that's pragmatic is the part where you're the question you're asking yourself, which is, what do I do? And that's where it starts, because much as it's talked about in blog posts and stuff like that, there's a lot of misconceptions around innovation, and these rarely get talked about. There's a lot of just going with the flow, grabbing some methods over here and applying them, and hoping it'll work, or somebody tells you it's going to work, but you really don't know.
Yeah,
you're just using it because it's
that chaos is always a good thing. Or one I've been hearing lately a lot for some reason is that innovation is about risk taking, which is it's like, so if I go walking around bad neighborhoods at night and use other people's needles, I'll be more innovative. That never made a whole lot of sense to me. And also, in the research I did for the book, I never came across someone telling me that that they thought risk taking was really important, where managing risk people mentioned quite a bit.
Yeah. So what are some misconceptions? I mean, what do you think of misconceptions around the topic of innovation?
I think the biggest and most harmful misconception is that innovation is about ideas, having ideas, creating ideas, brainstorming ideas. What I found in my research was that innovation is really centered around the problem. And if you can find a good problem, the ideas tend to come, whatever process you might choose. And in the organizations I studied, those types of ideation processes, they ran the gamut. I didn't really see how one process was better than another. But what I did see is that what really set the great innovators apart, the great innovative organizations, is that they had a systematic and disciplined process for seeking out new problems. And I think that's what really makes the difference, because every business is essentially a square peg business waiting for its round hole world. And it's going to happen eventually. It just recently happened to Intel, because when you're running a business is like a series of coin flips. I mean, you try and narrow down your options and improve your odds as best you can. But at some point, you have to take a chance on one direction or another. And eventually, you're going to get that wrong. That's just how life works. Intel, they got the coin flips right for 40 years straight or something. But eventually, their luck ran out with GPUs. Doesn't mean that they're any worse of a company that they were 10 years ago when things were going great. But you're eventually going to have that round hole world. And you have really two options. You can either wait for it to come and adapt, and that's probably not a good idea, because once you start adapting, you're already losing. Or you can start preparing ahead of time. Yeah. And some companies are, one company that I think's really done that well is IBM. They've had their business, their core business, disrupted 5 or 6 times. And every single time they went to their research division, and they were sort of like, well, there's this thing we've been working on for 15 years. And you know, if you have a 10, 15-year head start, you really don't need to be that fast or agile.
Yeah. And, you know, it's, you know, the common theme sometimes is, you know, a lot of us talk about like specific processes, as you were saying, that something that you follow determines whether or not something's going to work. But that's really the case. I mean, it really is a combination. You know, and I agree with you that the most important part is what it is you want to do instead of just throwing stuff at the wall. I mean, even if you define the stuff you're going to do and you have very clear that, you're still going to throw stuff at the wall, obviously. But my experience, most do not do that. They just throw stuff at the wall. And which is what my next question has to do with is, you know, why isn't business a shift of perspective and accept the inherent uncertainty that you know, these even when you have some clear idea, there's still uncertainty. You know, how do you manage that?
Well, uncertainty is obviously uncomfortable. I think what you're talking about is, look, there's always a certain amount of iteration that goes on. You know, your first idea is rarely going to be your best one. Where I think you run into trouble is where people believe that's a desired state. Being uncertain isn't a desired state. What innovation is all about is getting from uncertain to certain. And I think that's you know, that's the real almost Manichaean dichotomy of, you know, it's okay to be uncertain, but you have to, you know, you have to come up with a plan for getting from uncertain to certain. Uncertainty is just the human condition. Innovation is actually figuring it out. One of the people I talked to, who's in the book, is a guy named Jim Allison, and he developed something called cancer immunotherapy, which was actually a really big deal. He's probably going to win the Nobel Prize for it. Okay. And I asked him how you did it. He said, you know, I just like figuring things out. And he spent like 20 years figuring out how the immune system was regulated. And that's what he was really focused on. And then he had an idea one day that, hey, maybe, you know, because of the way the immune system's regulated, maybe we can fiddle with some switches and actually cure cancer. And it worked. Okay. But that was really, you know, after a 20-year process of him just going in, figuring different parts of the immune system out, looking at other people's work, and being part of the immunology community. So I really think that there's the issue with uncertainty isn't that you should feel comfortable with uncertainty, but that you understand that that's just part of the process. That
part of the process.
At it, you'll work it out.
That's part of the process. You know, I a few years ago, I had a situation. I mean, it always comes up, but at that point in time, I think I put a little more attention to it. But when you're creating like teams, in my you know, from my perspective is I always look for people who are willing to figure it out. You know, first sign of trouble, okay, first sign of trouble, that's fine, we'll figure it out. For some people, first sign of trouble is like, oh no, I don't want this. It's too uncertain. Figure it out. I mean, there's no you know, the first idea is really going to be the good idea. It's, you got to start off and at least having an perspective as to what you want to do, and then, you know, figuring out how that box is going to be put together is really the point.
Yeah, absolutely. I always hired for curiosity and temperament. I always thought if someone was curious enough and they could work well with others, they're probably a good hire.
So this takes me to the next question. Is your book's main idea is that innovation is not a path, it's an ecosystem. the tool that you came up with, which is called the innovation matrix, which you use to explain how companies like Google and IBM and others innovate. The interesting part is they all have different maps. So could you explain how Google innovates from compared to IBM?
Yeah, those two were really interesting ones. Google, I really thought had the best integrated approach, where everything seemed to connect very, very well with everything else. IBM is really focused on solving the driver of the innovation at IBM is really the research division. And they have a very interesting way of thinking about it. They think everything at IBM Research should both have be good for IBM and also good for the world. So they really do. I mean, they've had, they've won more Nobel Prizes than most countries have. And they've won them in really different fields. I mean, they invented the scanning electron microscope. They invented DRAM chips. They invented the relational databases. They didn't capitalize on them as well as some of them as they probably should. But even something like relational databases, where Oracle went out and made a whole industry out of what IBM had initially created, they still made money off of it. And a lot of their approach is just that, hey, we're going to stay 5-10 years ahead, and we're going to really, really push the horizons. And then we're going to figure out, and the business side will take care of itself. So definitely two very, very different organizations, but they both get the job done. I mean, IBM, a lot of people talk about now, they've had 19 or 20 quarters of declining revenues. But that happens to everybody at some point, right? When Google's 20 years old, though, it'll probably happen to them too. So the real question for Google is, can they be a successful business when they can no longer make money out of off of search engines? And I think Google has a pretty good shot at doing that. Facebook as well. But IBM's proven that they can do that, many times over. And even now, where they're getting killed because the cloud is disrupting their installed solutions business, they have a great business growing in Watson, and then on the horizon with quantum computing and neuromorphic chips. So they're always working 5-10 years in the future. So it was really interesting contrast between the two of them.
What would you say is the, you laid it out like in the matrix? What would you say is the main difference? Well, because obviously IBM is huge transformation from products to services. I mean, I don't think people remember that IBM used to make the computers. That was a long time ago, but now they don't. And to make that transformation you rarely see that, especially in a big company like IBM. Now, as you were saying, Google is I think you put it in the book that about 99% of its revenue comes from search.
Yeah, it still comes from search and web-related businesses, essentially search.
Yeah, and everything is other.
Yeah, I mean, that's, obviously that's not sustainable. I mean, they might be able, look, Intel kept it going as a one-trick pony for 40 years. So maybe they'll have a good 40-year run of it. But, they're still building stuff out at Google X, with Verily, with Waymo and the self-driving cars. So, they do quite a bit of exploration. But just about the matrix in itself, that was really the core of the book to solve the problem I always had, which was there was, when you're running a business, there's always incredible pressure to innovate, but how do you go about it? And there's so many great ideas, disruptive innovation, open innovation, lean launchpads, design thinking, that I always found it very, very confusing. And I think where a lot of organizations get stuck is they fall into the trap of saying, this is how we innovate. We're a design thinking company, or this is how we innovate.
Yeah.
You know, we're an open innovation company, or whatever it is, which is really, you know, another way of saying we've picked our solution. We don't care what the problem is. And it's really important to sit down and think, what kind of problem is this? What do we have, before you start running off and choosing your solution. It's a pretty simple concept, right? Focus on the problem first, then work out a solution. Don't pick your solution and just try and shove whatever problem comes down the road. So that's really the core of the book.
Yeah. You know, I remember when you published that. I believe you published it first on your blog, and then you published it in Harvard Business Review. And it was, I don't know, you tell me if that was one of the most shared blog posts you ever had, because it's
a funny story, actually.
A lot.
It never really did that well. You know,
no?
when I posted it, it didn't really do very well. I don't really remember it doing badly. Did okay, right? But it's kept doing okay every day for 4 or 5 years. So, you know, today I'll probably have 150 hits on that post. So, you know, when it adds up altogether, it'll probably have 50,000 views this year. Just,
yeah.
You know, just consistently every day. It gets some audience.
It turned into a book. The idea turned into a book, and that's probably going to have more.
Yeah.
After it's
I would hope so. Yeah.
People are gonna be like, wow, you actually published it a long time ago. Why didn't I know? You know.
Yeah, it was really interesting because it was never like, nobody was ever like a wow post, but with the consistency that it gets readership, I've never had anything like that where it just consistently gets readership day after day, year after year. So I figured this is an idea that's sticking somehow.
Yeah.
And I also found myself coming back to it. You know, you come up with these ideas every now and then.
Yeah.
They seem really good at the time, and then, you know, 6 months later, maybe I wasn't quite right about that, or maybe there's a better way you could frame that.
Yeah.
But in the last 4 or 5 years, it's pretty much stayed the same, and it still makes sense to me.
Yeah. All right. So, you know, you're right. How Google's 7-20-10 model is at the core of how they innovate. What obstacles do established organizations have to implement a similar model?
Yeah, well, that isn't Google's. I mean, they've adopted it. It's not really clear where Google got that. Whether they came up with it independently, or whether they had seen this 3 horizons model. I think the real obstacle is setting time for this exploration. You know, so many organizations, you know, are so focused on getting better and better at what they already do. And that's a big part of it. You know, that's 70%. A lot of, you know, the innovation guru types, they say, oh, well, that's just incremental innovation. And I always say, yeah, well, so is Moore's Law, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, you know, that's like compounding interest. That's how, you know, that's your bread and butter. But I think you have to have that realization that we are a square peg business waiting for our round hole world. And we need to set aside some resources to explore adjacent markets, adjacent capabilities, new markets, new capabilities, or eventually, you know, it's going to catch up with us.
Yeah. I've the way I've always tried to, or not tried to, more than that's how I kind of detect, is I ask, executives or business leaders if, tell me what you can tell a lot by how they lead, and also how they what are their priorities, or what are they prioritizing towards the future, and you rarely get answers about exploration. It's more like doing the same on a day-to-day basis, and just optimization, up until who knows when, until the wheels fall off.
Or they have a very specific vision of the future,
Yeah.
which they're quite certain about. And if it doesn't work out that way, they're going to be in some trouble.
Now, do you think that because Google gets written a lot about, a lot of I've resisted to keep using Google as an example, just to find some other examples for people, but the model is really applicable to just about anybody. I mean, it's not something that's in isolation and just a big company can use. Even a startup can think about these things. How do you go about thinking about it and say, let's put it on a day-to-day basis, make it reality, thinking in those horizons?
Yeah, again, I think that, I mean, Google, I wouldn't say they have one model. I think one thing that you can really learn from Google is they really have a portfolio of strategies. And I think most successful innovators do. With this sort of 70-20-10, again, I just think they really understand that, it's important to have to work on some things in the horizon. They don't throw a lot of money at them, but they're exploring them. And they're what I think is really unique about Google, and would be very, very hard to copy, is just how well it's all integrated culturally. How 20% time, becomes. I use the example of the Google Brain project, which was a 20% time project, which became a Google X project, and then went back into the general Google, and helps fuel what they're doing now, but then is also helping fuel their second and third horizon type of innovations, like self-driving cars and other things.
Yeah. All right. So you also talk about, which is also an interesting part, where you talk about platforms, basically the future, how innovation happens in platforms, and how you have to leverage them nowadays. Specifically, you're not talking specifically about like social media and stuff like that, but you are talking about using networks, either for resources, for information, or just all-round collaboration. How do you feel as though nobody's looking at this still?
No, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's come out about platforms recently in the past couple of years. There's been 3 or 4 books that sold pretty well: The Platform Revolution, The Network Imperative, and something else. And they're interesting in their own right, very analytical. They tend to be economic models that this is this class of platform, this is that class of platform. But again, I looked at it differently. I looked at it, okay, what do you do with these things?
Yeah.
And it became clear to me that the issue with platforms is really that, because of digital connectivity, that if you're depending only on your internal resources these days, it's really hard to compete. And you have to use platforms. And what you use platforms for is to access ecosystems of talent, information, and technology. And I explain in the book various ways of how that's done. But I think just at the core, I think you always need to be looking, how can we how can we extend our internal capabilities in talent, things like talent, technology, and information, and augment them with platforms.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
One of the interesting things as well was, because platforms tend to be an open innovation strategy, but IBM really used open platforms as a sustaining strategy. When it was very interesting when Microsoft saw Linux, they saw it as a threat, where when IBM saw Linux, they said, oh, wow, we don't make any money on operating systems anyway. This is a bunch of stuff we don't have to do, and there's like 10,000 developers who'll keep it current.
Yeah.
And they still, to this day, they look to open source a lot of things and work with open source communities to get that sort of basic technology, which then they can build, and then they can focus their resources on building proprietary applications on top of it.
Yeah. What do you think now? You mentioned Microsoft. Microsoft has been changing quite a bit. You know that they're also pro open source. As of recently.
Yeah, they recently came out and said Microsoft loves Linux, but they've been going in that direction for a while. I don't know if you remember, but I was saying 2 or 3 years ago, Microsoft's not the company you think it is. You know, and I talk about it in the book that, you know, Steve Ballmer said this incredibly stupid thing about iPhones, that nobody's ever going to buy them and everything else, back in 2007. And everybody's, oh, it's the end of Microsoft. They missed mobile and everything else. And then since 2007, they've grown their business at about, you know, grown revenues at better than 10% a year and maintained 30% margins. I mean, that's a great business any way you slice it. And I don't, you know, Nadella is getting a lot of the credit for it now, but most of that actually happened under Ballmer. And I think he did a much better job than most people give him credit for.
Now, do you think that the reason they've been doing this, or just kind of like coming out and saying, you know, embracing open source, is because of you know, the change that they're seeing, or is it because more of a threat?
I don't think they had any choice anymore. You know, so much they started building out cloud technologies back in like 2001. When nobody called them cloud technologies. And it was all in this one division called Systems and Tools, I think it was. But those cloud technologies these days really need to be open source. So I mean, the big shift was, I think 2011 it was, with the,
Asher?
Flipping my mind, what was the video game thing?
Xbox? The Xbox?
Yeah, but you know, the motion.
Kinect.
Yeah, with Kinect, that was their big shift back in 2011, and I think it had been brewing before that. So now that they've fully embraced and come out, you know, full-throatedly, isn't really all that surprising. It's a process that's been going on for quite a while.
I think Microsoft doesn't get a lot of credit. I mean, because if you look at their R&D spend, I mean, they get criticized for this. They spend a lot of R&D, but not a lot comes out of it. And I think Kinect was one of those products. Research.
Kinect was Skype Messenger. They have Azure is a great product, and it's really doing well. And, you know, all this time they say, wow, they're really investing so much in R&D and they're losing in mobile.
Yeah.
Cloud technologies. Doesn't look so silly now, does it? You know, there is a, pretty much like IBM started their research division 25 years ago. And there's a long, you know, 15 years at least to build a good fundamental technology. So, you know, a lot of this stuff's been brewing, but another thing people don't realize about Microsoft, they haven't had a losing quarter in, you know, an unprofitable quarter in like over 40 years. I mean, that's a track record that nobody can match. And they're still like the 3rd most valuable company in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just an outstanding business track record. So they must be getting something right. And another thing, I think it's almost like both with Microsoft and IBM, you know, it's almost like reverse survival bias. Everybody who was, because most of the companies that were to Microsoft and IBM gone, nobody remembers them.
Yeah.
You know, people don't realize how impressive it is that these two companies are still around after multiple technology cycles, and they're still competing.
Unbelievable. You know, when I read that line in your book that they haven't had an unprofitable quarter for for a long time, I was like, I mean, you rarely, I mean, you can tell. I mean, you follow Microsoft, you know that, but if you don't, you know, follow like stock and stuff like that, you don't know it, man. But it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, well, I think another thing with Microsoft and IBM is they don't make consumer products.
Yeah.
You know, consumer products aren't their strength. So they don't really capture the zeitgeist like an Apple or a Facebook or a Google does, you know, stuff that people use every day. So I think that has to do with it a lot. Even among technology journalists, they don't seem to understand an enterprise business quite as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you also mentioned in your book that collaboration is an, you know, I can say the new competitive advantage, but it's a big competitive advantage. What is that?
Yeah, I mean, well, first there's just the data trends. I mean, you can see, and I wrote in the book, there was some studies done by Nature on the papers in their own journal, where back in the, you know, in the early 1900s, most of the papers were sole authorships. By 1950, that had switched, and most of the papers published were co-authored. And now, you know, the average is 4 times that, and it's not uncommon to see papers written by over 100 people. But I think just generally, we're tackling far more complex problems. They more often need interdisciplinary skills. And very much like the old saying that, you know, whoever you are, most of the smart people work for somebody else. You know, whoever you are, most of the best capabilities lie somewhere else. And again, I think with the rise of digital technology and the ability to collaborate much more effectively, if you're not collaborating effectively, I think that makes the gap that much wider. It was, you know, it was a different thing when, you know, all we had was telephones, and telephone calls were really expensive, and air travel was really expensive. Then whether you're collaborative or not didn't matter as much, because your ability to collaborate wasn't as complete. But now that we have such a, you know, such amazing possibilities to collaborate in so many ways, if you're not able to do that, you're probably going to fall behind pretty fast.
Yeah. What do you think makes a good collaborator, not individually and also in an organization?
Well, there's been some good studies on this about what makes teams work. Google did some studies around safe spaces. There's been some other studies about diversity of more diverse teams being more effective. One of other studies about whether everybody talks in roughly equal amounts, or, you know, whether 1 or 2 people are dominating the conversation, and the teams where people are speaking in roughly equal amounts tend to do better. But I really think what it all comes down to is being a good listener as well as a good talker, and having that safe space for ideas, where people are comfortable sharing their ideas without fear of some sort of rebuke, like what a stupid idea or something like that. And and I think that's true both with individuals and organizations. I mean, is this an organization where you're afraid to speak up, or is this an organization where if you can shoot down somebody's idea at a meeting, you become, the hero for the day? Or is that the type of thing where, your boss will take you aside and say, hey, look, that's really disruptive?
Now, how do you find this in the companies you studied? How did you find this was put into practice, like good listening, the psychological safety of, being able to express yourself? How do you put this into place?
Sorry, you beeped out there for a second. How did I find whether they were psychologically safe or not?
Yeah. How do you put in?
It's pretty easy to tell. It really, really is. Towards the end of the book, I talk about my interactions with some of these people, and how when I got on the phone with them, they were, or met them in person, they were just as interested in what I was doing as I was with what they were doing.
Yeah. And
there was a funny thing how when I sent them excerpts, or in some cases whole chapters, to be fact checked to make sure I was getting everything right, they sent back not only helpful suggestion, but they actually went through and copy edited, fixed my spelling and everything.
Wow.
And I thought, like, what a waste of time. Here's this world famous scientist, basically doing pro bono copy editing for me. But then when I thought about it, I thought, you know what? That's probably what makes them a great innovator, that they just want to pitch in and do whatever they can to help.
Good, man.
There's an absolutely fantastic story you can find it on the web. But when Danny Hillis, who these days is known as a computer genius, but when he was still like a graduate student, he started a computer company to do parallel computing. And one of his friends from graduate school was Richard Feynman's son. So they invited Richard Feynman to, the great physicist, to come and help out. And he said he was just amazed how he just showed up and he said, okay, what do you have for me to do, boss? And, here they have this Nobel Prize winner, and even among Nobel Prize winners, just an absolute legend. And how, he'd be the guy to go out and, and get coffee for everybody, or clean up the lab, or, go and pick up lunch at the deli or whatever. So, and he mentioned what an effect that had on him. And so I think that type of attitude, I think it helps in two ways. One, it just makes the work atmosphere better. But I think just as importantly, it helps you build up a network of contacts. So you end up really increasing your access to information, because those people tend to build up wide networks, much more than a typical aggressive A personality would be, who tends to make people feel more guarded.
Yes. That's very good, man. That's a good story. Just to finalize, what are the key ideas that you want business leaders to think and hopefully execute after reading your book?
Well, I think one is definitely, don't worry about coming up with a great idea. Go out and find a good problem. And the second is, you really, a lot of it is just going out and exploring.
Yeah.
And you have to set aside some time to explore. Competitive advantage is no longer the sum of efficiencies. It's really becoming the sum of connections. And power is no longer, from the top of the heap, but from the middle of the network.
I think you made me with that, the last line. you made me remember. I think what's this guy's name? He says that the fortune favors the connected mind. So there you
I
go.
have heard that. I can't remember who said it, but it's good.
Yeah, yeah. It's he's also an author. Um, uh, Stephen Berlin Johnson, I think. Stephen Johnson. That's the guy. Something like that. But that's exactly
Oh,
what
it's he
you
who
said
said it.
right there. That's
I think
exactly
I've
what you
read
just said.
all of his books except one.
The last one.
No, I did read the last one.
Hey, Greg. So, I mean, any parting thoughts you want to say? You know.
No, just thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you having me on.
Well, it's my pleasure, Greg. You know, as you know, as we were said at the beginning, I've been following you for quite a long time, and I enjoy reading your stuff. I come back to it quite a lot. I mean, I bookmark your stuff, so I also share it with other people because I say, hey, read this stuff because you have a very unique way of connecting ideas and you know, you tell the stories and you connect them and that's something that's you know, admirable for at least for me about you.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much for that, Jorge.
Yeah. All right, Greg. Well, I'll let you go, and I'm sure you're busy. So thank you so much for, you know, sharing your insights with me and my listeners, and you know, let's keep in touch.
Thanks for having me, Jorge.
Thank you.